This is the moment Professor Richard Steinberg realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his academic career. There he stood, frozen in stunned silence, staring at a whiteboard covered in equations that would reshape his understanding of mathematics forever. Equations written by the community college student he'd spent the entire afternoon trying to humiliate. But to understand how we got here, how a 19-year-old night shift warehouse worker named Damon Williams brought one of America's most prestigious mathematics professors to his knees in front of 75,000 live-stream viewers, you need to see what happened when Professor Steinberg decided to make an example of the kid in the hoodie sitting in the back row. Because what started as a simple math competition became something much bigger, a battle that would expose the ugly truth about who gets to be brilliant in America and who gets to decide. 3 hours earlier, the grand auditorium at Riverside University buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that only comes with high stakes. The annual Mathematics Open Challenge wasn't just any competition. It was the golden ticket that could transform a struggling student's entire future. Winners walked away with full scholarships to MIT, Harvard, or Stanford, plus a $50,000 research grant that could launch careers before they even began. Professor Richard Steinberg adjusted his silk tie as he surveyed the crowd from the judges' panel. At 52, he commanded respect in academic circles that most mathematicians could only dream of. A Fields Medal nominee, author of 3 groundbreaking textbooks, and the man who'd solved the Hartwell conjecture that had stumped brilliant minds for 30 years. Today, he was the guest judge, the final word on who deserved to join the mathematical elite. The auditorium held over 200 of the brightest undergraduate minds from across California. Students from UCLA, Berkeley, Stanford, and Caltech filled the pristine rows, their designer laptops and expensive calculators glinting under the stage lights. The live stream counter showed 15,000 viewers and climbing. This wasn't just a competition, it was a showcase. A public exhibition of intellectual superiority broadcast to universities worldwide. Then Damon Williams walked in, 20 minutes late. His worn backpack hung loosely from one shoulder, the faded Los Angeles Community College hoodie standing out like a stain against the sea of university-branded sweaters and blazers. The security guards at the door had almost turned him away. Surely there'd been some mistake. Community college students weren't supposed to be here. This was for real universities, real students with real futures. But Damon's acceptance email was legitimate, earned through a qualifying exam that he'd aced despite taking it on his phone during a break at the warehouse where he worked nights loading trucks. While his competitors had been coached by private tutors and guided by professors with decades of experience, Damon had taught himself advanced calculus from library books, scribbling equations on napkins during his lunch breaks. He found an empty seat in the back corner, ignoring the whispered comments that followed his path down the aisle. Is he even supposed to be here? Someone should check his credentials. This isn't a charity case competition. Professor Steinberg noticed him immediately. The professor's eyes narrowed as he took in the boy's appearance. The cheap sneakers, the backpack held together with duct tape, the way he pulled out a basic scientific calculator while everyone else used graphing calculators worth more than Damon's monthly rent. Steinberg had seen this before. Community colleges had this habit of sending their top students to competitions like this, completely unaware that they were setting them up for public humiliation. It was almost cruel, really. "Are you lost, son?" Steinberg's voice carried across the auditorium as the pre-competition chatter died down. "I believe the community college information session is in the building next door." Scattered laughter rippled through the crowd. Phone cameras started turning toward the back row, capturing what everyone assumed would be an embarrassing moment of a kid realizing he was way out of his league. The live stream chat exploded with comments. "Someone's about to get destroyed." "This is painful to watch. Why is he even here?" But Damon didn't flinch. He simply pulled his registration confirmation from his backpack and held it up. "Damon Williams, confirmed participant. I think I'm exactly where I need to be, Professor." Elena Vasquez, the department head serving as co-judge, shot Steinberg a warning look. She'd built her career fighting these exact attitudes. climbing from a working-class background to become one of the most respected mathematicians in the country. She knew talent didn't come with a pedigree, but she also knew how the game was played. This young man was about to walk into a lion's den. As the warm-up problems were distributed, something interesting happened. While the other students immediately reached for their expensive calculators and started furiously scribbling notes, Damon simply stared at the paper for 30 seconds, then began writing. No calculator, no scratch work, just clean, elegant solutions appearing on his answer sheet as if by magic. Maya Carter, a mathematics major from Berkeley sitting 2 rows ahead, craned her neck to catch a glimpse of his work. What she saw made her do a double take. His approach to the problems was completely different from anything she'd learned in her advanced courses. Where she needed 5 steps, he needed 2. Where she required complex formulas, he used simple geometric insights that made the solutions appear almost obvious. "That's not how they taught us to solve those," she whispered to her study partner. Professor Steinberg noticed the buzz building around the back corner and felt his jaw tighten. Community colleges had different standards, lower standards. They probably taught shortcuts and tricks instead of proper mathematical rigor. What this boy was doing might look impressive to other students, but any real mathematician would see through the facade. The stage was set, the battle lines drawn. In one corner, institutional prestige, academic credentials, and the weight of mathematical tradition. In the other, raw talent, desperate hunger, and nothing left to lose. But neither side knew what was really about to unfold in the next few hours. How could they? After all, how do you prepare for a revolution? The warm-up period ended, and Professor Steinberg rose from his chair with the confidence of a man who'd never been wrong about anything that mattered. He'd watched Damon's unconventional problem-solving for the past 20 minutes, and his initial assessment hadn't changed. Flashy shortcuts might impress other students, but they were no substitute for real mathematical foundation. It was time to expose this charade before it went any further. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steinberg announced, his voice carrying the authority of decades in lecture halls, "we'll now begin our elimination round. I'll be calling volunteers to solve problems publicly at the whiteboard." His eyes swept the auditorium before landing squarely on the back corner. This will separate those who truly understand mathematics from those who simply memorize tricks. The live stream viewer count had climbed to 25,000. Phone cameras emerged throughout the auditorium like flowers turning toward the sun. Everyone could sense that something significant was about to happen, though most assumed they'd be witnessing a swift and decisive humiliation. "Let's see what our visiting student can handle," Steinberg continued, his pause loaded with implication. "Mr. Williams, would you care to demonstrate your abilities for our audience?" The auditorium fell silent except for the soft clicking of recording devices. Maya Carter found herself holding her breath. Dr. Vasquez shifted uncomfortably in her chair, recognizing the setup for what it was. This wasn't pedagogy, this was a public execution. Damon felt every eye in the room focus on him like a magnifying glass concentrating sunlight. He could hear his heart beating in his ears, could feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on his shoulders. These weren't just his dreams on the line. They were proof that kids like him belonged in rooms like this, that brilliance didn't require a trust fund or legacy admission. "I'll give it a shot, Professor," Damon said, standing slowly. His voice carried farther than he expected in the silent auditorium. Steinberg smiled the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. He turned to the massive whiteboard behind him and began writing a problem that looked deceptively simple at first glance. A basic calculus integral with clean coefficients and familiar functions. But hidden within its elegant simplicity lay a trap that had caught even honors students off guard. The function required advanced techniques from topology and complex analysis, mathematical territories that community colleges barely touched in their abbreviated curricula. "A straightforward integration problem," Steinberg announced to the crowd. "Though appearances can be deceiving. You have 10 minutes, Mr. Williams. Please take your time, no pressure." The live stream chat exploded with activity. Viewers were making predictions, placing informal bets, and sharing the stream with friends. Hashtag Math Showdown started trending on social media as word spread that something dramatic was unfolding at Riverside University. But as Damon approached the whiteboard, something unexpected happened in his mind. The problem Steinberg had crafted as a trap began to reveal itself like a puzzle box opening in his hands. He'd seen similar structures before, buried in the graduate-level textbooks he'd checked out from the library, hidden in the research papers he'd downloaded late at night when he couldn't sleep. The key wasn't in this complexity, it was in recognizing the simplicity that complexity often masks. Damon picked up the marker, feeling its weight in his hand. Behind him, 200 of the brightest mathematical minds in California waited to see him fail. Ahead of him, a live stream audience of thousands expected entertainment. To his right, Professor Steinberg stood with the satisfaction of a man about to prove a point he'd been making his entire career. None of them were prepared for what happened next, because sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person who's been preparing their entire life for this moment. Sometimes the kid from the wrong side of the tracks has been hungry enough to devour knowledge that others take for granted. But would hunger be enough when faced with a problem designed to humiliate? Could raw talent overcome institutional advantage? And what would happen when the first equations started appearing on that whiteboard? Damon stood before the whiteboard, marker in hand, and did something that surprised everyone in the auditorium. He didn't immediately start calculating. Instead, he spent 30 seconds simply staring at the problem, his eyes moving across the equation like he was reading a story only he could understand. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Phone cameras captured every moment of hesitation, every flicker of uncertainty that crossed his face. In the live stream chat, viewers began typing their predictions. He's frozen. This is painful to watch. Called it. He's out of his league. But Maya Carter, watching from her seat, noticed something different. Damon's expression wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Like a chess master who'd just spotted a familiar pattern 20 moves deep into a game. Finally, Damon began to write. But instead of diving straight into integration techniques like everyone expected, he started with something completely different. A geometric diagram. Clean lines emerged on the board, forming a coordinate system with carefully plotted curves that seemed to dance around each other in perfect mathematical harmony. "Excuse me," Professor Steinberg interrupted, his voice cutting through the auditorium's focused silence. "That's not the standard approach to integration problems, Mr. Williams." Damon paused, marker still in hand, and turned slightly toward the professor. "Sometimes the standard approach isn't the most elegant, sir." It was a simple statement, delivered without arrogance or defiance. But in the context of this room, with its weight of tradition and hierarchy, those words landed like a challenge to everything the academic establishment represented. Steinberg's jaw tightened. "Perhaps you'd care to explain your unconventional method?" "Of course." Damon turned back to the board and began narrating his approach. "The function here belongs to the Gaussian integral family, but most people don't recognize it because of how it's disguised. If we visualize it geometrically first, we can see that it has natural symmetry properties." His marker moved with growing confidence, adding annotations to his diagram. The traditional approach would be integration by parts followed by substitution, which works but requires about 12 steps. However, if we recognize that this function represents the area under a curve that's been rotated and scaled, we can use the symmetry to simplify before we ever start calculating. Maya Carter felt her mouth drop open. She'd struggled with similar problems for hours, using the methods her professors had taught her. Watching Damon's approach was like seeing a master locksmith open a safe that everyone else had been attacking with sledgehammers. "This allows us to evaluate the integral using the fundamental theorem in just 4 steps instead of 12, Damon continued, his equations flowing across the board with mathematical poetry. "We get the same answer, but the path is more direct." The auditorium had gone completely silent. Even the live stream chat had slowed its frantic scrolling as viewers tried to follow the logic unfolding before them. Dr. Vasquez found herself leaning forward in her chair, genuinely impressed by the elegance of the solution. But then Damon did something that changed everything. He stopped writing and stared at the original problem again, his brow furrowing slightly. For nearly a minute, he stood motionless while the audience waited. Some viewers wondered if he'd made an error, if the community college kid had finally hit his limit. Then Damon turned to face Professor Steinberg directly. "Professor, I think there might be an error in the problem statement." The words hit the auditorium like a physical force. You could have heard a pin drop in the sudden absolute silence that followed. Maya Carter's hand flew to cover her mouth. Dr. Vasquez's eyes widened. The live stream chat exploded with disbelief. Did he just... No way. This kid has balls. Steinberg's face cycled through several emotions: surprise, indignation, and something that might have been panic. "I beg your pardon?" Damon pointed to a specific coefficient in the original equation. "This coefficient here should be A divided by 2, not P divided by 4, based on the boundary conditions you've established. The way it's written now, the integral diverges at infinity, which means it has no solution." The professor's confidence visibly wavered. He pulled out his notes, the same notes he'd used to create the problem, and began checking his work. The auditorium watched in fascination as one of the most respected mathematicians in the country double-checked calculations that a 19-year-old had questioned. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. The live stream viewer count had jumped to 40,000 as word spread across social media that something unprecedented was happening. Finally, Steinberg's face reddened. He'd found his error. A simple transcription mistake when he'd copied the problem from his research notes. The community college student was correct. Not only had Damon solved the intended problem with remarkable elegance, but he'd also caught a mistake that had slipped past a Fields Medal nominee. The crowd began to murmur, a low buzz of excitement and disbelief. Scattered applause started from the back rows where other community college students had been sitting quietly all afternoon. Maya Carter joined in, clapping slowly but deliberately. Soon, nearly half the auditorium was applauding. That's a very astute observation," Steinberg managed, his voice strained. "Lucky catch. Anyone can spot typos, of course." But the damage was done. The dynamic in the room had shifted fundamentally. This wasn't just about solving problems anymore. This was about who had the right to question authority, who deserved to be taken seriously in academic spaces, and what happened when talent refused to know its place. Damon simply nodded and capped his marker. "Thank you for the opportunity, Professor." As he walked back to his seat, phones captured every step. The hashtag #CommunityCollegeGenius began trending alongside #MathShowdown. Comments poured in from mathematics students around the world who'd been following the live stream. "Did that really just happen? This kid is incredible. Someone get him a scholarship now." But in his chair at the judge's table, Professor Steinberg was already planning his response. His reputation, built over decades of academic achievement, had just been challenged by a teenager with a duct-taped backpack. He couldn't let this stand. He wouldn't let this stand. The real battle was just beginning, because if Professor Steinberg had learned anything in his long career, it was that sometimes you had to destroy someone completely to remind everyone else where they belonged. But first, he needed to figure out exactly who he was dealing with. How much did this boy really know? And how far was Steinberg willing to go to put him back in his place? The applause died down, but the energy in the auditorium had fundamentally changed. What started as a routine competition had become something electric, unpredictable. Professor Steinberg felt every eye in the room watching him, waiting to see how he'd respond to being corrected by someone who, according to every academic hierarchy he'd ever known, had no business correcting him at all. He stood slowly, straightening his tie, a gesture that had always helped him regain composure in difficult moments. But today, it felt like armor he was putting on for battle. Well, Mr. Williams, Steinberg said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that Dr. Vasquez immediately recognized. Since you seem so confident in your abilities, perhaps we should see how you handle something more substantial. Dr. Vasquez shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Richard, I think we should continue with the scheduled format. If he wants to play with the big boys, Steinberg interrupted, never taking his eyes off Damon, then let's see if he can handle graduate-level qualifier material. A collective intake of breath swept through the auditorium. Graduate qualifier exams were designed to challenge students who'd completed 4 years of rigorous mathematical training. They covered advanced topics that most undergraduates never encountered. For a community college student to attempt one wasn't just ambitious, it was academic suicide. The live stream chat exploded with activity. Viewer count jumped from 40,000 to 60,000 as notifications spread across social media. Students from universities around the world began tuning in, sharing links with friends. Had Math Showdown was now trending in multiple countries. Maya Carter grabbed her phone and started live tweeting. This professor just challenged a community college kid to graduate-level problems. This is either going to be inspiring or devastating. Had community college genius. But Damon surprised everyone again. Instead of backing down or showing intimidation, he simply nodded. What did you have in mind, Professor? Steinberg's smile was sharp as a blade. 3 problems. Increasing difficulty. 45 minutes total. You must explain your reasoning aloud as you work. He paused, letting the weight of the challenge settle. 1 mistake, and you're eliminated. No second chances. The stakes had just become impossibly high. This wasn't just about solving problems anymore. It was about public humiliation on a global scale. Damon could feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him. His warehouse co-workers had started watching the live stream during their break. His family was probably tuning in from home. Students from community colleges across the country were sending messages of support that he couldn't see but somehow felt. I accept, Damon said simply. Steinberg turned to the whiteboard and began writing the first problem. A multivariable calculus equation that involved complex analysis, the kind of mathematics that separated undergraduate education from graduate research. The symbols seemed to crawl across the board like an ancient language that only initiates could read. Your time starts now, Steinberg announced. What happened next defied every expectation in the room. Damon approached the problem with the same calm focus he'd shown before, but now there was something different in his manner. A quiet confidence that suggested he wasn't just solving these problems, he was recognizing old friends. He started with the Cauchy-Riemann equations, building a foundation that most graduate students struggled to master. The key insight here, Damon explained as he worked, is recognizing that this complex function has analytic properties that allow us to use contour integration. Most people try to force it into real analysis, but that's like trying to cut paper with a hammer when you have scissors available. His marker moved across the board with increasing speed and precision. The solution emerged in elegant steps that seemed almost inevitable once he showed the path. Where most students would need 30 minutes or more, Damon completed the problem in 12 minutes. Maya Carter stopped typing mid-tweet, her mouth hanging open. She'd taken graduate courses as an advanced undergraduate, and she'd never seen anyone work at this level with such apparent ease. The auditorium buzzed with whispered conversations. Other professors had begun arriving, drawn by texts and messages from colleagues who were following the live stream. Dr. Vasquez found herself taking notes on Damon's techniques. Some of his approaches were genuinely novel. Professor Steinberg's confidence was wavering, but his pride demanded escalation. The second problem appeared on the board. Differential topology combined with abstract algebra, material that challenged PhD students. Again, Damon approached it methodically. This looks complex, but it's really asking us about the fundamental group of a surface, he explained to the audience. If we think about it topologically first, the algebraic solution becomes much clearer. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Each problem that was supposed to expose Damon's limitations instead revealed new depths to his understanding. The live stream viewer count hit 75,000. That community college genius was trending worldwide. Students were sharing clips on every social platform, adding captions like, "This is why we don't judge books by their covers," and "When genius meets prejudice." But the most dramatic moment came during the third problem, when Damon paused halfway through his solution and turned to address the room. "You know what's interesting about this equation?" he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. "It's actually a special case of a more general theorem. If I modify the approach slightly, I can solve not just this problem, but an entire class of related problems." He returned to the board, and in front of an audience of the brightest mathematical minds in California, proceeded to demonstrate mathematical insights that some of them had spent years trying to develop. The room had gone completely silent except for the scratch of marker on the whiteboard and the soft clicking of recording devices. Even Professor Steinberg stood transfixed, watching someone half his age casually reshape problems that he himself had struggled with. But this was just the beginning. Because while everyone was focused on mathematics, they'd missed the real transformation happening in that auditorium. This wasn't just about solving equations anymore. It was about rewriting the rules of who gets to be brilliant, who deserves respect, and what happens when the system's assumptions crumble in real time. The question was no longer whether Damon could handle graduate-level mathematics. The question was whether the academic establishment could handle Damon. As Damon finished the third graduate-level problem with 7 minutes to spare, something shifted in Professor Steinberg's expression. The initial surprise had hardened into something more dangerous: calculated determination. Watching this community college student casually dismantle problems that challenged PhD candidates wasn't just embarrassing anymore. It was threatening everything Steinberg believed about intellectual hierarchy, academic credentials, and his own place in the mathematical universe. The professor pulled Dr. Vasquez aside during the brief intermission, his voice low but urgent. "Elena, we need to discuss the parameters of this competition." "Richard, what's there to discuss? The boy is exceptional." "The boy is making a mockery of our standards," Steinberg hissed. "Do you understand what's happening here? We have 75,000 people watching a community college student outperform graduate students. What message does that send about the value of institutional education?" Dr. Vasquez studied her colleague's face and recognized something unsettling. This wasn't about mathematics anymore. This was personal. "Richard, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm suggesting we maintain appropriate academic rigor. If Mr. Williams wants to compete at this level, then he should face the same standards we'd apply to any graduate student. Real standards." Meanwhile, Damon sat in the back row, his mind racing through what he'd just accomplished and what lay ahead. He could feel the weight of everyone's attention, but more than that, he could sense Professor Steinberg's growing hostility. This wasn't just about solving problems anymore. Somehow, he'd become a symbol of something larger, something that threatened people in ways he didn't fully understand. Maya Carter approached during the break, her eyes bright with excitement. "That was incredible. Where did you learn contour integration? Most undergraduates don't see that until graduate school." "Library books, mostly," Damon replied, pulling out his worn notebook filled with equations copied from advanced textbooks. "When you can't afford the classes, you find other ways to learn." "But some of those techniques, I've never seen them in any textbook." Damon shrugged. "Sometimes when you're teaching yourself, you have to figure out your own ways to make sense of things. The answers in the back of the book don't always show you the path." Maya photographed a page from his notebook and posted it on social media with the caption, "This is what self-taught genius looks like. #community college genius #math showdown." The image went viral within minutes, showing equations and insights that graduate students would recognize as genuinely sophisticated mathematical thinking. But while social media celebrated Damon's achievements, a different conversation was happening among the faculty. Professor Steinberg had spent the break making phone calls, reaching out to colleagues, building what he called appropriate oversight for the remainder of the competition. "I've invited Professor Margaret Hoffman from Caltech to join our judging panel," Steinberg announced as the competition resumed. "We want to ensure the highest standards of academic integrity." Dr. Vasquez felt a chill. Hoffman was known for her rigid adherence to academic protocol and her skepticism toward non-traditional students. Her presence would change the entire dynamic of the remaining competition. The next phase brought a series of rapid-fire challenges designed to test not just mathematical ability, but academic fluency, the unspoken language of university culture that separated insiders from outsiders. Challenge 4: Mathematical Terminology. "Mr. Williams," Professor Hoffman began, "please explain the relationship between homotopy equivalence and homeomorphism in algebraic topology." Damon paused. He understood the concepts intuitively and could work with them mathematically, but the formal academic language, the precise definitions and standard terminology, had gaps. Community college textbooks didn't delve into the sophisticated vocabulary that graduate programs took for granted. "The functions preserve certain structural properties," he began carefully, "but homotopy equivalence is more flexible in how it allows continuous deformation." "That's imprecise," Hoffman interrupted. "In graduate-level mathematics, precision of language is paramount. Please use the standard definitions." It was a subtle trap. Damon's mathematical understanding was sophisticated, but his academic vocabulary had holes, exactly the kind of gaps that traditional education was designed to expose and eliminate. The livestream chat began to turn. "He's struggling now. Maybe he's not as smart as we thought. Vocabulary matters in math." Challenge 5: Proof technique. The next problem required not just solving an equation, but constructing a formal proof using accepted academic conventions. Again, Damon's intuitive grasp was strong, but his proof structure didn't follow the rigid format that graduate schools demanded. "Your reasoning is sound," Professor Steinberg noted with barely concealed satisfaction, "but the presentation lacks academic rigor. Graduate-level mathematics requires adherence to established proof conventions." Each small criticism chipped away at Damon's confidence and the audience's perception. The crowd that had been cheering for the underdog began to murmur with uncertainty. Maybe the professors had a point. Maybe raw talent wasn't enough without a proper academic foundation. Challenge 6: Research context. "Place this theorem within its historical mathematical context," Hoffman demanded. "Cite the relevant literature and explain how it relates to current research directions." This was completely outside Damon's experience. Self-taught from library books, he'd focused on understanding concepts and solving problems, not memorizing academic genealogies and research citations. He stood silent for long moments, the weight of his limitations suddenly visible to everyone watching. Maya Carter felt her heart sink. The professors weren't just testing mathematical ability anymore. They were testing membership in an exclusive club that Damon had never been invited to join. But then something unexpected happened. Messages began flooding social media from graduate students around the world who were watching the live stream. "Those questions aren't about math ability, they're about academic privilege. I'm a PhD student and I couldn't answer some of those terminology questions off the top of my head. This is why brilliant people get excluded from academia." The hashtag academic gatekeeping started trending alongside #community college genius. Students shared stories of being intimidated by academic jargon that had little to do with actual understanding. The narrative was shifting again, but this time it was about something bigger than one competition. The pressure cooker moment. As the challenges continued, Damon felt the walls closing in. Each question seemed designed not to test his mathematical ability, but to expose his outsider status. The professors were making their point. Talent without proper credentialing was insufficient for serious academic consideration. His warehouse co-workers were still watching, their group chat filled with confusion. "What's happening?" Why are they asking him about history instead of math? This doesn't seem fair. But Damon's family was watching too. His younger sister had gathered her friends around a laptop in their apartment, explaining to them that her brother was representing everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong in smart people spaces. The ticking clock showed 15 minutes remaining in the extended challenge period. Professor Steinberg was preparing what he clearly intended to be the final crushing blow, a problem so complex and requiring such extensive academic background knowledge that no self-taught student could possibly succeed. Yet something was happening that the professors hadn't anticipated. The global audience watching this unfold was beginning to see through the academic theater. Comments poured in from mathematicians, engineers, and students who recognized that brilliant problem-solving was being overshadowed by credentialing games. Dr. Vasquez found herself at a crossroads. She could allow this to continue and watch a genuinely gifted young man be systematically dismantled by academic politics, or she could intervene in a way that might cost her professionally, but would serve justice. As Professor Steinberg prepared to deliver what he intended as the coup de grace, the question hanging in the air wasn't just whether Damon could solve impossible mathematics. It was whether institutional power would succeed in crushing individual brilliance, whether the system would protect itself by destroying the very talent it claimed to nurture. The real test was about to begin, but this time the equation being solved wasn't on a whiteboard. It was about human dignity, academic justice, and what happens when courage decides to stand up to institutional intimidation. Could one 19-year-old community college student change how the world thinks about intelligence and privilege? Or would the academic establishment successfully defend its boundaries against an outsider who dared to dream beyond his station? The next few minutes would determine not just Damon's future, but the future of everyone watching who'd ever been told they didn't belong. As Professor Steinberg prepared his final devastating challenge, Dr. Vasquez was quietly reviewing the solutions Damon had provided throughout the afternoon. What she discovered made her blood run cold, and then filled her with an excitement she hadn't felt since her own graduate research days. She pulled Professor Hoffman aside, her voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret, you need to see this." "Elena, I'm trying to maintain focus on proper academic standards. Forget the standards for a moment. Look at these solutions. Really look at them." Dr. Vasquez spread out copies of Damon's work across the judge's table. This approach to the contour integration problem, it's not just correct, it's revolutionary. He independently derived a method that could simplify an entire class of complex analysis problems. Professor Hoffman frowned, studying the papers more carefully. Her expression gradually shifted from skepticism to surprise to something approaching awe. "This geometric insight here, I've never seen this approach before." "Because it's original work," Dr. Vasquez continued urgently. "Do you understand what that means? This isn't a student regurgitating textbook methods. He's creating new mathematics in real time." The implications hit both professors simultaneously. If Damon's methods were genuinely novel and publishable, they represented the kind of breakthrough that could reshape entire mathematical fields. This wasn't just a competition anymore, they were witnessing the birth of potentially groundbreaking research. But Professor Steinberg, overhearing fragments of their conversation, felt his world tilting on its axis. For 3 years, he'd been working on research problems in complex analysis, problems that had earned him prestigious grants and speaking engagements. If this teenager's methods were as revolutionary as they appeared, Steinberg's own research could become obsolete overnight. The realization struck him like a physical blow. His reputation, his career trajectory, his sense of intellectual superiority, everything he'd built over decades, was being threatened by a 19-year-old with a duct-taped backpack. "Elena," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "we need to be very careful about making grandiose claims. Raw talent without a proper academic foundation can be dangerous." Dr. Vasquez looked at him sharply. "Dangerous to whom, Richard?" The livestream audience, meanwhile, had grown to over 90,000 viewers as news outlets picked up the story. But now, a different narrative was emerging in the comments and social media discussions. Mathematical graduate students and professors around the world were analyzing screenshots of Damon's work, and their reactions were unanimous. This wasn't just problem solving, this was mathematical innovation at the highest level. Original research began trending alongside the existing hashtags. University mathematics departments were forwarding the live stream to their faculty. Research journals were receiving emails asking if they'd seen the community college genius who's rewriting complex analysis. Professor Steinberg realized that his plan to expose Damon as academically unprepared had backfired catastrophically. Instead of revealing limitations, the challenges had showcased capabilities that threatened the established order in ways Steinberg hadn't anticipated. But there was still one card left to play, one that would shift the battle from mathematical ability to something much more personal and devastating. He was about to change tactics completely. Because if he couldn't defeat Damon mathematically, he would have to destroy him another way. Professor Steinberg rose from his chair with the deliberate movements of a man who'd just made a terrible decision. The mathematical battle had been lost, but there was another kind of warfare he understood perfectly: the politics of academic credibility and institutional trust. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steinberg announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question, "before we proceed further, I believe we need to address some concerns about academic integrity." The auditorium fell silent. The livestream chat, which had been celebrating Damon's innovations, suddenly filled with confused questions. Dr. Vasquez felt her stomach drop as she recognized what was happening. "Mr. Williams," Steinberg continued, his tone shifting to something colder, more prosecutorial, "your demonstrated knowledge of advanced mathematical techniques raises some important questions. These methods, contour integration, topological insights, novel approaches to complex analysis, are typically not taught at the community college level." Damon felt the shift in the room's energy like a physical weight settling on his shoulders. "Sir, I'm not questioning your intelligence," Steinberg interrupted, though his tone suggested exactly that. "I'm questioning your sources. Where exactly did you encounter these advanced techniques? These aren't methods you could simply figure out from basic textbooks." The implication hung in the air like poison. Maya Carter's hand flew to her mouth as she realized what was happening. The live stream comments began to turn ugly. Wait, is he saying the kid cheated? How would a community college student know graduate-level math? This doesn't add up. Damon's voice cracked slightly as he tried to respond. "I taught myself from library books, research papers I found online." "Research papers," Steinberg repeated, seizing on the admission. "So you're claiming to have independently derived techniques that match published research? That's quite a coincidence, don't you think?" Professor Hoffman, despite her earlier surprise at Damon's originality, found herself nodding. Academic misconduct was serious business, and the boy's explanations were starting to sound implausible even to her. "Perhaps," Steinberg suggested with false concern, "we should have campus security review Mr. Williams' materials. Check his phone, his notes, ensure there are no external assistance applications or stored solutions." The words hit Damon like a physical blow. Security, phone searches, public accusations of cheating in front of nearly 100,000 viewers worldwide. His family was watching. His co-workers were watching. Students from community colleges across the country who'd been inspired by his success were about to see him destroyed. I don't cheat," Damon stammered, his usual confidence crumbling under the weight of institutional suspicion. "I just love mathematics. I spend every free moment studying, learning." "Love is admirable," Steinberg said with a patronizing smile, "but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the claim that a community college student independently developed research-level techniques that happen to match published work is, frankly, extraordinary." The security officers who'd been summoned during the break now approached the back row. The humiliation was complete and public. Phones captured every moment as Damon was asked to surrender his backpack, his notebook, his calculator for verification of academic integrity. The livestream chat exploded with doubt and disappointment. I knew it was too good to be true. Community college students don't do original research. He must have been copying somehow. Maya Carter watched in horror as the narrative collapsed around someone she'd just been admiring. Even she found herself wondering, how could someone self-taught really know so much? Maybe the professors had a point. Damon sat in his chair, shoulders slumped, as his materials were examined like evidence in a crime scene. The boy who'd been solving graduate-level problems with revolutionary insights minutes earlier now looked exactly like what Professor Steinberg had always claimed he was, a fraud who'd gotten in over his head. But then Dr. Vasquez did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stood up slowly, walked over to where Damon sat, and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of her own experiences with academic discrimination. "Damon," she said quietly, but loud enough for the microphones to catch. "Look at me." He raised his eyes, which were bright with unshed tears. "I need you to remember something. I was questioned once too. Not about cheating, but about belonging. Because of my accent, my background, the color of my skin. They asked me where I really learned what I knew, as if knowledge had to come with the right pedigree." She turned to address the entire auditorium. "I have a Fields Medal on my wall. I've published over 50 research papers, and I'm telling you right now that what this young man has shown us today represents the kind of mathematical thinking that appears maybe once in a generation." The room stirred uncomfortably. Dr. Vasquez was putting her own reputation on the line. "So here's what we're going to do," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "We're going to give Mr. Williams one final challenge. Not a trick question, not academic gatekeeping, not citation memorization. Pure mathematics. The hardest problem we can construct." She looked directly at Professor Steinberg. "And if he solves it, when he solves it, you're going to apologize to this brilliant young man in front of everyone watching." The auditorium fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the air conditioning seemed thunderous. Dr. Vasquez's challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down before medieval knights. Professor Steinberg found himself trapped between his desire to maintain academic hierarchy and the very public stakes that Dr. Vasquez had just created. "Very well," Steinberg said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "If Dr. Vasquez insists on this demonstration, then let's make it definitive." He turned to the whiteboard and began writing with the deliberate movements of a man constructing an execution device. The problem that emerged was unlike anything that had appeared earlier, a monstrous equation that seemed to sprawl across multiple mathematical disciplines like a beast with too many heads. "This," Steinberg announced to the hushed crowd, "is a problem from my own unpublished research. A problem that has stumped faculty at MIT, Harvard, and Caltech for the better part of 18 months. It requires knowledge from complex analysis, differential topology, abstract algebra, and number theory." The live stream viewer count had exploded past 120,000. News outlets were running live updates. University mathematics departments around the world had stopped their normal activities to watch what was unfolding in real time. "Solve this, Mr. Williams," Steinberg continued, his smile sharp as a blade. "And I'll personally recommend you for Harvard. Fail, and perhaps we can put this unfortunate episode behind us." Damon stood slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. The security search had found nothing suspicious, just a worn notebook filled with equations and insights that spoke to thousands of hours of solitary study. But the damage to his confidence had been devastating. Maya Carter grabbed her phone and typed frantically, "This is it. Win or lose, this kid is about to make history. Hat Math Showdown, Hat Final Boss." As Damon approached the whiteboard, something remarkable happened. The problem that Professor Steinberg had designed to be impossible began to reveal its secrets to him like an old friend sharing confidences. His mind, trained by years of wrestling with concepts in library silence, started to see patterns that others had missed. The structure of this equation, Damon began, his voice growing steadier with each word, looks complex because it's trying to solve multiple problems simultaneously. But if we recognize that these different mathematical frameworks are really describing the same underlying geometric reality, he picked up the marker and began to work, his movements becoming more confident as the mathematics flowed through him. The audience watched in fascination as he seemed to dance with the equations, each step revealing new insights. Most people approach this by trying to force it into one mathematical framework or another, Damon continued, his voice now carrying the quiet authority of someone who truly understood what he was doing. But the elegance comes from recognizing that complex analysis and topology are just different languages describing the same truth. Professor Hoffman found herself leaning forward, genuinely intrigued despite herself. The boy's approach was unlike anything she'd encountered in her 30 years of mathematical research. The key insight, Damon said, his marker moving with increasing speed and precision, is that this isn't really a complex analysis problem disguised as topology or a topology problem disguised as algebra. It's a pattern recognition problem disguised as advanced mathematics. What happened next would be replayed in mathematics classrooms for decades to come. Damon stepped back from the board and pointed to a specific section of Professor Steinberg's original equation. "Professor, I think there's a fundamental assumption error in your approach." The words hit the auditorium like a thunderclap. Professor Steinberg's face went pale. "I beg your pardon." "Your assumption about convergence breaks down at infinity. See here." Damon pointed to a series of terms in the middle of the equation. "You're treating this series as absolutely convergent, but these boundary conditions actually make it conditionally convergent, which changes everything." The livestream chat exploded with activity as mathematics professors around the world began frantically checking the work. Comments poured in from PhD students, research mathematicians, and university faculty. "Holy shit, he's right. How did he see that? Steinberg's been working on this for years and missed that." But Damon wasn't finished. "Actually," he continued, his confidence fully restored now that he was in his element, "this isn't just solvable once we correct that assumption. It's trivial once you see the pattern." The words "it's trivial" in mathematics are the equivalent of a mic drop. When a problem that has stumped brilliant minds for months is called trivial, it means someone has found an insight so elegant and fundamental that it makes all previous approaches look unnecessarily complicated. Damon returned to the board and began a solution that was breathtaking in its simplicity. Where Steinberg's approach had required advanced techniques from multiple mathematical fields, Damon's insight reduced the entire problem to a series of geometric transformations that any graduate student could follow. The reason this problem seemed so complex, Damon explained to the transfixed audience, is that everyone was looking at it backwards. Instead of trying to force these different mathematical frameworks to work together, we should recognize that they're all special cases of a more general principle. As he worked, something unprecedented happened in the auditorium. Graduate students began spontaneously applauding specific insights. Professors started taking notes frantically. Dr. Vasquez found herself grinning with the pure joy of witnessing mathematical breakthroughs happening in real time. "But here's the really interesting part," Damon said, stepping back from his completed solution. "This approach doesn't just solve Professor Steinberg's specific problem. It provides a general method for solving an entire class of similar problems." He turned to face Steinberg directly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet power of someone who had just rewritten the rules of the game. "Professor, your 3-year research program just became a 20-minute classroom demonstration." The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Steinberg stared at the whiteboard where his life's work had been not just solved, but revolutionized by someone he'd spent the afternoon trying to humiliate. The equations on the board were undeniably correct, elegant, and transformative. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Steinberg said the words that would be quoted in mathematics journals for years to come. That's actually brilliant. The auditorium erupted. Students leaped to their feet in standing ovation. The livestream chat became an incomprehensible flood of celebration, amazement, and mathematical emoji. Maya Carter was crying as she live-tweeted, "I just watched genius defeat prejudice in real time. This is why we don't give up on people. Hashtag and as community college genius hashtag math revolution." But the most powerful moment came when Dr. Vasquez approached Professor Steinberg at the judges' table. "Richard," she said quietly, "I believe you have something to say to Mr. Williams." Professor Steinberg looked at the young man who had just changed mathematics, changed his own understanding of intelligence and potential, and changed the trajectory of both their lives forever. The question was no longer whether Damon belonged in academic spaces. The question was whether academic spaces were worthy of Damon. As the applause died down and Professor Steinberg approached Damon to offer what everyone expected would be a grudging acknowledgement of defeat, Dr. Vasquez received a phone call that would change everything once again. "Elena, this is Dr. James Morrison from the National Science Foundation," the voice on the other end said urgently. "We've been watching your live stream. We need to talk immediately." Dr. Vasquez stepped away from the celebration, her expression growing serious as she listened. When she returned to the judges' table 2 minutes later, her face was a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice cutting through the residual chatter, "I've just received some extraordinary news." The auditorium quieted again, though the energy remained electric. The live-stream viewer count had reached 150,000, with major news networks now covering the story live. The National Science Foundation has been monitoring today's competition. They've informed me that Mr. Williams's solution methodology represents what they're calling a significant breakthrough in computational mathematics. They're prepared to offer him a full research fellowship, bypassing traditional degree requirements entirely. The crowd erupted again, but Dr. Vasquez held up her hand for continued attention. But that's not all. 3 major universities, MIT, Stanford, and Caltech, have just submitted formal requests to fast-track Mr. Williams directly into their doctoral programs. Not undergraduate admission. Doctoral programs. Maya Carter grabbed her friend's arm, both of them staring in amazement. Did she just say they want to skip his bachelor's degree entirely? Professor Steinberg, who had been preparing to deliver his reluctant apology, found himself witnessing something unprecedented in his academic career. Universities didn't bypass degree requirements. They didn't fast-track students from community colleges into PhD programs. The institutional machinery simply didn't work that way. But exceptional circumstances demanded exceptional responses. Furthermore, Dr. Vasquez continued, the International Mathematical Union has requested copies of Mr. Williams' work for immediate peer review. If validated, his insights could be published in the Journal of the American Mathematical Society, making him potentially the youngest person in history to publish breakthrough research in pure mathematics. The implications were staggering. Damon hadn't just won a competition, he'd apparently triggered a revolution in how the mathematical community identified and nurtured talent. Professor Steinberg realized that his attempted humiliation of a community college student had inadvertently introduced the world to its next mathematical genius. His 3-year research program wasn't just obsolete. It was about to be cited as the problem that launched someone else's career. The hunter had become the hunted, the teacher had become the student, and the mathematical world would never be quite the same. The moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Professor Steinberg stood before Damon, the weight of 150,000 viewers watching his every expression. The man who had entered this auditorium confident in his intellectual superiority now faced the humbling reality of acknowledging genius in the last place he'd expected to find it. "Mr. Williams," Steinberg began, his voice carrying none of its earlier condescension. "I owe you an apology. A profound apology." He paused, clearly struggling with words that didn't come naturally. "I was wrong. About your abilities, about your potential, about everything. What you've demonstrated today isn't just exceptional, it's extraordinary." The live stream chat erupted with satisfaction as viewers finally witnessed the justice they'd been craving. But Damon's response surprised everyone. "Professor, we all have more to learn," he said simply, extending his hand. "Maybe we can learn from each other." The handshake that followed, captured by dozens of phones and broadcast to the world, became an instant symbol of what happens when prejudice meets grace, when institutional power encounters genuine humility. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward to make the final announcement. "The Riverside University Mathematics Department is proud to offer Mr. Williams our first ever direct doctoral fellowship, full funding, research assistantship, and the opportunity to continue developing the revolutionary methods he's pioneered today." But the real victory was already visible in the faces around the auditorium. Maya Carter was organizing a tutoring program for underserved students before she'd even left her seat. Other community college students in the crowd were texting their professors about research opportunities. The warehouse workers watching from Damon's job were discussing an education scholarship fund. 6 months later, the ripple effects were undeniable. Community college funding had increased across 3 states. The hashtag Community College Genius movement had inspired dozens of hidden talents to emerge from unexpected places. Damon himself was thriving at MIT, where his unconventional background had become his greatest strength. But perhaps the most important change was simpler and more profound. Somewhere, right now, another young person who doesn't fit the traditional mold is looking at Damon's story and deciding to believe in their own brilliance. Because that's what happens when we stop asking whether someone deserves a seat at the table and start asking whether our table is big enough for all the geniuses in the world. Your story is waiting to be written. What impossible problem are you afraid to tackle? What would you solve if you weren't afraid of being wrong? Share this story with someone who needs to believe in themselves. Subscribe to Black Voices Speak for more stories of people who refused to be counted out. And remember, brilliance doesn't require permission. It just requires recognition. Sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person who's been preparing their entire life to change everything.